for now, I think we make our way out here and we see what we've got going on. If we've got anything going on. I think it'll be a good fun time, though, as we make our way through 3.9. Good Lord. Again. Start this event up. Oh, goddamn. I had us at 2:33. Did you have us at 2:33, Jack? Is Jack here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh.
I'm just reading. Yeah, 233, but several.
Yeah, several correctives. It's basically the sort of pull back, reconnection to everything that's happening, just to make sure that we have a grasp over what exactly he's saying, so people don't just take it as garbage. So we'll give that a second. We'll get there. Let's see.
Oh no, wait, we read that.
We did?
I think so, because I challenged you on the social machine thing. I think it's thus the importance.
Thus, the importance of human surplus value remains decisive. Yeah, I mean, it's. I'm down with all this. I find this is easy. So
Yeah, I mean, we can start in either or, but yeah, we did read. I believe we did read, but several correctives.
Works for me. Works for me. Let's get a bot in here and we can start it up. I am coming through somebody, though. Keep hearing myself. I think it's Ben. I think you're echoing in.
Now recording.
Okay. I will mute myself.
There we go.
In a second.
Not a problem. We'll give everyone a moment or two to join up and get that sort of moving. How's everyone doing, by the way, on this lovely Tuesday? Is it an exciting time for everyone else, too? Good, exciting stuff? No? Maybe a little? Don't everyone talk at once now. I would hate that. That would be terrible if I got answers or if we were having conversation.
We're mourning a serious loss. I don't know if you heard about the shooting, but Slim Shady was murdered. So it's a tough
very
time
nice,
right
very nice, very nice, very nice. We are missing Richard Simmons in the world, and I will say, for some of us who are a little bit older, the kids, I probably only know him as that. Well, I mean, everyone only knows him as that weirdo, but genuinely, some of the best David Letterman moments. He did Whose Line Is It Anyway a few times, and it was genuinely wonderful. So he is missed, but otherwise, yeah, we're in a fun place. So I guess I'll go ahead and kick us off and say, hey there, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are continuing our reading of 3.9 as we understand how the civilized capitalist machine operates. It is an incredibly dense section, so I'm not going to be able to obviously bring it back up to where we're at, but we've been going over the nature of how capitalism has, through its interior and exterior limits, how it produces those, how within that, the automated systems, the use of what Marx would call industrial capital or constant capital, industrial capital versus constant capital. Constant capital being very particularly the wages, let me get that backwards. I've been rereading the translation and the words are slightly different, so it's fucking up my brain. Within Marx, capital comes and explores the world of industry in basically two ways. There are wages paid out to workers. Each of us gets $10 an hour or $2 a widget or whatever it may be. We are paid for our labor. This capital is variable, Reason it's variable is because it can be depressed, it can be increased. This number is able to be shifted because the other half is not. It costs a certain amount to have a big factory. It costs a certain amount to have the parts. It costs a certain amount to have the materials needed. The example we end up going back to, because I think it's at this point, it's more Freudian. I'm having my dream of having a pizza shop. But if I rent a pizza shop, rent is kind of set. I can bargain, but it's going to be set on a monthly basis. That's done. And rent only does one thing, gives me that place. If I buy a pizza oven, it only really does that thing. A pizza oven doesn't have variability in what it can produce. There's good pizza ovens and bad pizza ovens, but if I buy a pizza oven, it does the pizza ovening. That's its thing. So this outlay of capital is constant. We have variable capital on the other side of things, this being you, the labor, the person. And this is because you can actually produce differently. You produce wildly differently. Some people produce a little bit. Some people produce a great deal. We have hands and feet and eyes and brains. We can produce varying amounts. This is where the capitalist finds profit. The ability for us to take all that capital that's invested, let's say it's $1,000 total dollars, but half of that is in labor. There is an excess that is produced. That excess profit, the surplus value that is produced in our pizza place, this is then attached to the capital that the industrialist has, and off they go to the next thing to buy another pizza place and have external capital do the same thing again and again and again and again and again. This is sort of the nature of capitalism. This is the nature of economics. This is not wild, crazy, weird shit. This isn't even, this is like within Keynesian economics. This is within everyone. This is how this works. This is how, if you have a business with a balance sheet, this is how it operates. So it's important to be thinking about capitalism in this way. The paragraph we just finished reading goes through the nature of the machinic surplus value, where we can talk about machines as working too, which they do. This extraordinary thing happens where machines come along, they're produced by this constant capital, and they develop automation, productivity, and this can't really be, this sort of thing works in a slightly different way, because what they want us to start thinking about is all the parts that are the labor of the person. We have a blacksmith, for example, or a pizza maker. Let's just stay with pizza. Back in the day, a pizza maker, a guy who ran a pizza place, and when I say back in the day, I mean like, 200 years ago, they kind of did everything. When I say everything, they would get maybe raw ingredients, but they would generally have to make their own mozzarella. They would make their own pizza sauce. They would make their own pepperoni. They would have to find wood and burn it in a wood oven. There was a lot of parts in being a pizza guy, like what labor means, what a pizza guy means. But this is code. This is code value. Code value is what a pizzaman is. And we don't call them pizza smiths, but this is kind of the point. Over time, as we have other machines that come in and take on edges here, little bits here of what the pizza guy does, we have entire machines that do the full kneading of the dough now. They're big, gigantic fucking mixers. They're huge and they're nightmarish to work with. But then a guy doesn't have to make 1,000 pizza doughs. He makes one gigantic one, and then there's even machines that flatten the pizza dough for you now, so you don't have to spin it anymore. There's no more spinning in the air. They have these big presses that press it down and flatten it completely. These are parts of pizza manning, pizza smithing, you might say. These are the codes that are being decoded. This is what we're coming to, and this is the point they're trying to make and help us sort of get past this idea of a traditionalist view of how labor interacts with things and having a man versus machine or man versus nature or machine versus nature dichotomy inside of this, because they want us to start looking at how capital breaks down codes in how it operates. The one side of things, as they talk about, because we'll get back to this paragraph, because again, this is really complex, but the thing they're wanting us to sort of spend a little bit of time on, I'll just read. On the one hand, codes continue to exist, even as an archaism, but they assume a function that is perfectly contemporary and adapted to a situation within personified capital. They become a capitalist, a worker, a merchant, a banker. On the other hand, and more profoundly, every technical machine presupposes flux of a particular type, the flux of code that are interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. It is these flux of code that find themselves encasted, coded, or overcoded in pre-capitalist societies. In such a way, they never achieve any independence. A man in a pre-capitalist society was fully just the entirety of a blacksmith or an astronomer or whatever that job was, a shoemaker, whatever it may be. But capitalism frees, deterritorializes, and decodes the flux of code, just as the others, to such a degree, the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body or its structure as a field of forces, while depending on a science and a technology, on so-called intellectual labor distinct from manual labor of the worker. In this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, that is constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes technical means of production. There are, in Japan, there's one in San Francisco, a wholly robotic pizza shop where like the entire thing is a robot. And there's a person that has to watch over it, utilizing intellectual labor. Is that guy a pizza maker? Because he has to use tools. He's using tools to do that, but it's been, the code of that has been extracted, has been decoded, has been shifted to the space of the technical. The person, that element that is labor exists differently now. The manual labor exists differently now, even though the work being done is much the same. You got something to say, Ben? I'm hearing Ben.
Oh, am I unmuted?
Yeah, no, I've been hearing you ding, ding, ding.
Oh,
hitting them buttons.
my bad. Yeah, I was tapping on my phone. No, I kind of think of this like, uh, that sort of guy manning a robotic pizza shop or like automated facility of production. It's sort of like I guess like a train engineer, right? Like carrying anything. Like we don't carry things anymore, right? Like we just have a guy who maintains the machine who does.
Mm-hmm. And that guy, it's one of those fun things. It's more of an intellectual exercise, but is that guy still a train conductor? Even though he's not doing any of the work a train conductor did 50 years ago, he's tapping a few buttons. Is he still a train? I mean, he is. His interaction, the tools he's using, how the machine operates to the point of automation is extraordinary. But again, the technical modes of production are produced by capitalism through this. This is one of the big pushes that they're wanting us to grasp. Instead of thinking through, I think, how I always viewed it, I'll just use myself rather than, damn anyone else. But how I always sort of viewed a lot of these things is that we become alienated as machines are made more, as machines make capital more and more, as machines make the industry more and more automated, they push out people. And that's not really quite true. Capitalism produces these machines. And ultimately there are fewer people. There's less direct labor. The code is the same, but the decoding of what that work is, and then the recoding of it into technical objects and into intellectual labor shifts it around. It's an extraordinary shift. And it's, Lily, it's not quite art, craft to tech. It's again, rethinking what we mean when we're talking about tech, when we're talking about the technical or what machine means. Instead of talking about the dichotomy between man and machine when it comes to a job, the job ultimately is making a pizza. That's what a pizza maker does. They make pizza. Now, if I have an automated system that does it 99% and I have a laborer there who presses a button, they're still pizza maker. 99% of the job is being done by an automated machine. And we've been able to do that because capitalism decodes what the labor was originally that was being done and finds ways to efficientize, automate, technize them, which is not a word, but that kind of thing is happening. And so that thing that happens shifts his relationship from being a pizza maker that's manual labor to being pizza engineer, as Ben says, a much more intellectual labor capacity. This shift in how the capitalist machine handles labor, handles things and pushes down on labor is going to become really marked of importance pretty soon here. Lily says, but they know astronomy, but the person taking care of the machine in pizza shop does not necessarily know pizza. They know the labors. So let's talk about what an astronomer did and the number of calculations that they had to do when they had more manual equipment that didn't do things automated. A friend of mine rebuilt the computer system for a big fucking telescope out by San Francisco. And the way these things worked when they were manual 2,000 years ago required an extraordinary number of not just calculations of what you wanted to look at, but all the steps unto it, before it, time of day, just an insane amount of shit that is completely automated now. Now, an astronomer now is aware of stars. They don't do that labor anymore. Engineers don't, they once upon a time didn't have calculators, not a very long time ago. They were doing a lot of this shit by hand. But now it's mostly automated. The work being done, the manual labor that has been replaced by automated machines, is this process of the decoding of the actual labor. It's intellectualized. We've moved to that space of being intellectualized. So someone who is an astronomer now doesn't do any of the labor before. They generally don't make their own lenses. They don't deal with that side of things. There's larger efforts in automated machines that handle a lot of that. They don't have to get up and actually move the goddamn telescope. They tap a few buttons, but they're still an astronomer. Someone who's watching over the quality assurance of pizza actually probably knows a decent amount of pizza. A pizza engineer would, like the guy who's watching over the robot, his job is to make sure that what's coming out is the pizza wanted. Does he understand how to sprinkle cheese just right, or why you use the backside of a spoon? No, because none of these things matter. He doesn't give a fuck to do any of these things, because that's not his job. The labor has been moved to being automated as the labor was decoded. Does that make sense, Lily?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm thinking of as how much of this is already set up. I mean, if the person's just given, okay, here's all the ingredients and the amounts, you just press all these buttons and the stuff comes out and goes on there. And if the machine breaks, that's what they know about. They know about how to fix the machine, but they don't really know or care about, what's going on the pizza. They just
But
push
they
all the
don't know.
buttons.
So they don't know how to fix the machine necessarily, and they may not know
Oh,
all the parts because it's.
no, but
Sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry, but I'm thinking of someone who does.
Hmm.
That's their job, is to run the machine, keep the
Oh,
machine
okay.
running. But what it does is, well, whatever it does.
Pretty much. And again, think of it as the code of labor or the codes of old and the nature of being decoded and recoded. This is kind of the push because it's the thing we continually see capitalism doing. It takes labor being done, human experience, human effort, whatever it is. And it goes, hey, where can I make profit? Can I make profit here? Excellent. Let me efficientize and modernize this. And what they
Okay,
do.
so that's, sorry, I keep interrupting. That's a different person though. The person who decides what's going to happen, is that the person you're thinking of?
Oh no, there's a lot of
Isn't it?
people in the chain. Like a machine doesn't come out of nowhere. And the process doesn't come out of nowhere. Everything is, again, historically determined, and they come into a certain space. Someone who, within capital, businesses have a sort of drive towards efficiency because there is this sort of tendency for profit over time to shift and fall, for wages to become stagnant, for product to become stagnant, for competition to show up. There's like a lot of weird market forces that are at play here. they talk a little bit about this. So what happens is you have a guy who's a pizza maker, and he goes, God, it would actually save me money if I could get, at the simplest, if I could figure out a way to automatically grate cheese, that would save like 2 hours of my employees' time a day. Because what he's done is he has, in that moment, he's decoded the coded labor of pizza maker. He's taken apart and he's figuring out a way to automate it. Now, that's one dude in one instance. Now, when we end up in this mass, huge society where we have thousands upon thousands of pizza makers who are all trying to break this, there's thousands of decoding elements happening until we get to the point where it's this weird, efficient sort of, we might say the art is lost from it. But what's happened is we've decoded all the labor that was in pizza making. And we're still decoding more, and we're doing it for everything. It's the nature of all of this, the codification of, well, here's what a pizza maker does. It's implicit. It's not really anything else than that. And it's the thing that's interesting that capitalism does. It breaks those down, and it figures out these things could be automated. Some guy automates cheese. Another guy automates pressing a dough. Another guy automates mixing of dough. Another guy automates, dropping tomatoes in and adding spices for sauce. And soon you have all of the pieces that allow the machine that is the robot to be made. But there's still an engineer now involved. It's shifted the labor from being manual labor of crushing tomatoes, of manually having to fucking knead dough for hours, manually having to toss or press or spread out dough. All of these things, these pieces have been decoded and then shifted and then recoded as automated labor, the machine, the technical machine showing up. And this happens at large in massive numbers. And at some point, it's happening to kind of everything. And so we have this really interesting interaction where, as they say, I'm echoing. JK, I'm echoing really bad. The forces, as they're talking about, suddenly becomes this so-called intellectual labor distinct from manual labor of the worker. This is the evolution of the technical object. As they say, in this sense, it's not machines that create capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes technical modes of production. I hope that makes sense. It's about breaking down all the parts of things and sort of shattering them further and further and further. And it happens to some industries extremely in depth, but it's happening to everything. So the decoding is the big action here to go over. All right, JK, what you got?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that the capitalism is responsible. It is the agent of this technology for efficiency, right? Its purpose is to efficiently produce the most profit, and if that's the only concern, then there are no really concern for the quality of the product, is there? So it's if that's the main concern, then the quality is lost and profit increases. As long as the profit increases, there's going to be more and more decline in the quality of the products, right?
So I would say sort of, but I would add their big caveat, which is when we talk about responsible or the reason that something happens or the cause, it isn't capitalism that is the cause. It's important to remember it's very similar to the earth or the despot. The despot doesn't actually build the pyramids, but we refer to it as the Pharaoh built the pyramids, even though we may say like the Pharaoh made the slave. The reason it happened was the Pharaoh. Well, we fall back on. Pharaoh falls back on. This is one of the things they're not quite at yet, because they're talking about sort of the way capitalism operates and how it produces and the things that happen within it. So I'm hesitant to say no, but I'm also very hesitant to say yes. So it's a little more nuanced than that. But generally, I would say yes, this is what happens within capitalism. And it has to do a lot with, as we were talking about in the despotic, the way that our desire is sort of manufactured, how we are produced. And they're kind of working their way backwards to this because we haven't gotten to Oedipus, quite yet, where there is a chapter called Oedipus at Last. Like we're making our way through this as we sort of get to how capitalism actually does this. But the way that the profit is set, the way all these things, tend to be the center of stuff, it has to do very significantly with, at the center of capital, the way capital itself works in capital, in money, currency. We find ourselves as socially determined, and we do it in capital itself. The X and Y of old Earth, the filiative and the alliant, the ability for us to produce more and the ability for us to make alliances, connect to more people, that at one point gets put through the despot, so all controls him, is now within capital. This is where desire moves to. They'll get into why and how, but we're starting to see that because, again, capital is breaking down the codes of old, what it meant to be a pizza maker, a blacksmith, an astronomer, any of these things. It's changing what those things are in terms of the actual labor of it, and automating and efficientizing and shifting in order to drive ultimately that X plus DX equation. What is the surplus profit we can have that we can put against the differential of more capital? And that combination is what allows us to invest more, to grow more. If there's a negative number, the economy is collapsing, blah, blah, blah. If it's a positive number, everything's going really great. This is the thing that sort of sets it in motion. And why? So let's get to the first paragraph of actually today, because we're not quite there. So let's talk about this first paragraph. Let's give it a read and make it through. But several correctives must be introduced in this regard. These breaks and cleavages take time. Their extension is very wide-ranging. By no means does the diachronic capitalist machine allow itself to be revolutionized by one or more of its synchronous technical machines, and by no means does it confer on its scientists and its technicians an independence that was unknown in the previous regimes. Doubtless, it can let a certain number of scientists, mathematicians, for example, schizophrenize in their corner. It can allow the passage of socially decoded flux of code that these scientists organize into axiomatics of research that is said to be basic. But the true axiomatic is elsewhere. Leave the scientists alone to a certain point, let them create their own axiomatic, but when the time comes for serious things, for example, non-determinist physics, with its corpuscular flux, will have to be brought into line with determinism. The true axiomatic is that of the social machine itself, which takes the place of the old codings and organizes all of the decoded flux, including the flux of scientific and technical code, for the benefit of the capitalist system and in the service of its ends. That is why it has often been remarked that the Industrial Revolution combined an elevated rate of technical progress with the maintenance of a great quantity of obsolescent equipment, along with a great suspicion concerning machines and science. An innovation is adopted only from the perspective of the rate of profit its investment will offer by the lowering of production costs. Without this prospect, the capitalist will keep the existing equipment, stand ready to make a parallel investment in equipment in another area. This is where we see the work of scientists in the corner. This sort of odd little interplay that's happening. Breaks and cleavages where you actually see a lurching forward of everything. It takes time. I mentioned with the pizza shop, lots of very, very small ones, but there's also big, large leaps that happen. And you tend to see them very, very large at once. In the last couple months, I don't know if you've noticed, but Vicks VapoRub shit has been in everything. Mentholatum, and eucalyptus. There's a weird thing that happened. It's been for years. These sort of larger chemical companies have been trying to figure out ways to synthesize it, make a version of it that doesn't just take the real thing. They finally figured out how to do that. But where can this be used? Well, suddenly it's in everything. NyQuil has versions of it. There's tons more breath fresheners. There's cereal. I saw yesterday that's Fruit Loops ice cream that has that makes your mouth cool. And it's because it has this shit in it. These things happen all at once. They increased profit. They didn't change any of these things. It's not the first time someone wanted to do any of these things. But because there was this larger sea change, suddenly they were able to make shifts to how all of these elements are produced. And because they would increase profits, they made the call across the board. You see this happen a lot. Lego's famous for doing it. Lego, the company. Lego always made fairly expensive bricks, and they made them locally where they were at Denmark. After a bit of time, they started shipping overseas, having them produced elsewhere, but they could never quite get or figure out how to make that setup happen. But then one day they did, and Lego actually, from there, was able to manufacture enough to become more of a mainstream toy rather than this odd secondary. You're all too young to remember this probably. It happened when I was younger, when I was like 9 or 10, and Lego became a thing. It wasn't a thing prior to that. It was around, but it was an expensive toy. It was a foreign toy. It was an odd thing. This shifting was massive, and it was a complete shift in how tooling is done. You see this a lot now with my last example. I used to work in licensing with toys and stuff, Star Wars and shit, and Avatar. And one of the things that really is fascinating is the tooling process of actually getting a toy made. It sounds simple to spin up a factory. It sounds in your head. It's like, oh, it'll take a few months. It's like 18 months to 24 months from the idea of a toy to getting it produced. At least it used to be. Now, thanks to 3D printing, 3D printing has been around for a very long time. It's not new. But the way that 3D printing was able to change over time and shift, the way 3D printing was able to work, suddenly about 3 to 4 years ago, they started changing the entirety of how tooling was done in order to utilize this tech. Why? Well, because, again, it would have cost too much to make this switch earlier. But now, because of the cheapness of everything, it was able to make its way. And suddenly the tooling is, I want to say, down to 9 to 10 months, depending on the toy company, depending on the setup. So what it means to have this relationship to technical is not that the latest thing matters. It's kind of what this paragraph's going at. It's not that the latest, coolest shit wins. That's not the setup. The latest shit doesn't matter at all. Will it drive more profit is actually the only question that matters. If you can do that, then the thing takes over. If it's just a cooler, better way of doing it, better for the environment, better for everyone, less labor, but it costs 3 times as much, I'd rather have, as a capitalist, I shouldn't say as a capitalist, I would rather have a whole bunch of people living shitty wages in a third world country making this thing than having a very expensive machine that costs, $100 more a month because it just doesn't drive the profits. This is the push. They're kind of making their corrective to the previous paragraph. The previous paragraph makes it sound like, oh shit, the new thing always takes over. And capitalism kind of plays with that. The secondary sort of play that sort of goes with that is, can you drive profit? And then suddenly, this is where it matters. This is where the scientists who are off in the corner having fun and doing their thing, building their little toys, their little batteries, whatever it may be. Well, can it drive profit? Well, then we bring you in and it marks it. It's kind of a fascinating sort of setup. I'll be quiet now and take questions or comments from anyone. Anyone? I know someone's here and someone's got a question. I'll look at YouTube chat. Oh, yes, the Lego thing. No, people had them in the 60s and 70s. The fascinating part is when you look at actually how they shifted their production from the 60s and 70s into the 80s before they made the Technic series and they actually moved into a much larger setup. No, they were around, but the way that they manufactured and how they built in the 1990s, it completely changed everything because of manufacturing practices, actually very specifically. They had made the switch to plastic years before, but the entire way that worked is really interesting shit, I think. It's worth looking into. It's really fascinating. I find it fascinating, I guess. But yeah. But it's really, yeah. I mean, because they ended up, they did the capitalism thing. Lego did the capitalism thing that's really interesting, which is where they overindulge because that's what you fucking do when you're a business. They were like, it's hard to describe what Legos were like in the 90s. Because they were they were cool, they were fun, but in like the early 90s, I want to say 89, 90, they started making a move into being a much larger product. They've always been only plastic anyway, Titan, but how they're manufactured and the scale and the process, and it's stuff you wouldn't even notice. Genuinely, you wouldn't notice, because if they do their job right, the manufacturing ends up, being generally the same. But the ability for new machines and new processes to save them, 2% a year is a huge deal. And as soon as they do that, they started doing these gigantic Lego building competitions and selling these huge sets. It was the first time they did like giant sets. They did like all this crazy shit, and they peaked in like the mid 90s. And what happened is they started getting rid of their old designers who had really built the sets. Like, I grew up with Castle and Pirates. Castle is my favorite set. The guys who had built all of these original sets, they got rid of them. And they started replacing them with younger, cheaper people from colleges. Like, literally what we're talking about here, by the way. It's the guys who did the old actual manufacturing, knew every step, what it meant to be a Lego designer. They replaced it with like super cheap guys who did shitty versions of it. And they actually peaked really hard and then started slowly collapsing. It was actually a really huge deal. They had a massive amount of layoffs. But literally, this process is what they're talking about. Like, it's why I use Lego as an example here. Maybe I didn't explain it perfectly, but the history of Lego is really fascinating in this way. As you start, getting manufacturing better, changing what it means to build the sets. We don't think of Lego guy or toy maker as a thing, but it is. And the guys who designed the sets went through it, figured out how they'd be put together, how they'd be boxed. These guys who were really there since before they were plastic, all got laid off and replaced with fresh college grads. And it kind of fucked that company up. It's kind of fascinating. I think it's fascinating. And yes, it is bleak. Capitalism is not a good thing. It's a better thing, but it's not a good thing. There's a lot of problems with it. A lot of problems with it. There's a lot. It's bleak. Don't worry, it's not all bleak, but it is pretty bleak. The Lego thing is fascinating. And Ben says, I worked as a CNC operator for years in the 2010s. Production is crazy complicated. It's insane. It's insane now. And when you go back and you have my grandfather, he was on the team that built like Titan missiles. He worked for Martin Marietta. He was an engineer. And my favorite story of his, because he was a kid who he became an engineer straight out of the Navy. He didn't have any college. And he and his team got laid off. This is one of my favorite stories. Applies almost exactly to this. His team was the ones, they were, on the Titan project, got laid off before it really started. And about a year later, they got asked to come back because they could not figure out what was wrong. See, the kids, they had hired a bunch of college kids, fresh college grads and engineers who were brilliant with computers and knew how to model stuff and automate everything completely. But somehow they could not get the pieces of the fucking missile to connect because it was always off by a couple millimeters. And they're in this big warehouse in Colorado. And story as my grandpa tells it is he goes, well, I can bring my team back and we can fix this. This will be pretty easy. Like, what are you talking about? He goes, you see the windows? Just cover them up. Like, what? Like, it's summer. The heat from the sun's making the damn thing expand. The the realities of what it means to know every part of this versus the automation versus the simulation. He was right, by the way. It turned out that the metal was being expanded by the heat, and that's why when they'd actually put it in this one spot in the warehouse, it would expand and it wouldn't fit. But automated, the removal of skilled labor, moving it to being more this automated management labor or intellectual labor now instead of traditional manual labor. The shifting of what it means to be an engineer, to be a designer, to be any of these things. This is the setup. And the way that we get rid of old machines is when it's profitable. We get rid of the original shit, always. And it's part of this whole thing. It's the deal. Because the old machines aren't really the thing. If no one has a question or comment, I kind of want to move to the next part, if everyone's down with it. Lisa says, oh, you guys are talking about Legos still. Ben says, crazy how it's expressed differently in Japanese companies, though, where they don't get rid of employees the same way, but instead of horrific working conditions and expectations. This is accurate. This is accurate. It's an extraordinary, it's a very different, I wouldn't say good, very different way of dealing with it. Lisa remembers Legos in kindergarten. Yeah. Wish they had girl-coded Legos as a child. You know, my daughters too. All the girl Legos, the girl-coded Legos are like, it's really awful, actually. Not to go on too much of a tangent. All the Legos that exist that are boy-coded or what they would call neutral, I don't think they're neutral, are built sort of to be able to fit within any other set. They're sort of they're kind of all kinds of colors. It's not really about the colors, but it's about the shapes. The girl-coded ones have pieces that are expressly not able to be included in other sets because of the way that they are connecting and how they connect. And the minifigs are different. It's very frustrating. Very frustrating, Lisa. Very frustrating. Mabel, section makes a lot of sense to me. It does leave me wondering about how companies sometimes seem to have a need to narrativize their own incentives to appear to be about innovation and improvement rather than solely profit. Well, it's because everyone's solely about profit. And so when you say you're about profit, it really doesn't land well with anyone because everyone, it's the kind of thing, would you ever say the opposite? Then why are you saying the thing? Question I like to ask when I'm in these kinds of discussions. No, actually, we're looking at making less money this year than ever is the kind of thing. Like if it's a statement that's new, it's neutral then because it's everyone. When we talk about innovation, it's how you're going to innovate. Oh, we're going to actually introduce AI into our deleuze readings here at the DGQC. And we're going to replace Brooks because Brooks, it's a lot of work to do what Brooks does. So it's just going to be an AI that does it. Now, we expect users to be upset at first, but over time, we think they'll learn to accept it. And that kind of thing, the DGQC obviously is going to be more profitable very, very quickly. So it's fire when we do that. It drives profit. We don't want to just say the profit thing, though. Deleuze actually, and Guattari will get into that actually as we get going here, why it has to be encased otherwise or spoken of differently, but it's a very interesting phenomenon for sure. Yeah, there are girl-coded Legos, and one sec, I want to make sure I get the name of them right because I always make jokes about this because I hate it. My daughter doesn't even want them. So Lego Friends. The worst fucking thing. I'm gonna give you an image. Here you go. It's their inclusive girl focused. Yeah, it's by the worst. And the pieces don't work with other things because they're the way they're designed, they're like one-offs. They're intentionally only ever that thing. The whole point of Legos is that they're parts of things. But hey, what do I know? I worked on Lego for a long time, actually, so I kind of knew. I kind of know. They've changed guard a few times. No one cares there anymore. Let's see. All right. Sweet. We'll move to the next paragraph unless anyone has a thing for me. Does anyone have a thing for me? Thus, the important The importance of human surplus value remains decisive, even at the center and in highly industrialized sectors. What determines the lowering of costs and the elevation of the rate of profit through machinic surplus value is not innovation itself, whose value is no more measurable than that of human surplus value. It is not even the profitability of the new technique considered in isolation, but its effect on the overall, this is terrible. My PDF reader is shit. There it is. But its effect on the overall profitability of the firm in its relationships with the market and with commercial and financial capital. This implies diachronic encounters and countersecting, such as one already sees, for example, in the early part of the 19th century, between the steam engine and textile machines, or techniques for the production of iron. In general, the introduction of innovations always tends to be delayed beyond the time scientifically necessary, until the moment when the market forecasts justify their exploitation on a large scale. Here again, alliance capital exerts a strong selective pressure on machinic innovations within industrial capital. In brief, where the flux are decoded, the specific flux of code that have taken a technical and scientific form, are subjected to a properly social axiomatic that is much severer than all the scientific axiomatics, much severer, too, than all the old codes and overcodes that have disappeared. The axiomatic of the world capitalist market. In brief, this is, by the way, a very long paragraph. We're going to do the whole thing and make our way through, don't worry. In brief, the flux of code that are liberated in science and techniques by the capitalist regime engender a machinic surplus value that does not directly depend on science and techniques themselves, but on capital. A surplus value that is added to human surplus value and that comes to correct the relative diminution of the latter, both of them constituting the whole of the surplus value of flux that characterizes the system. Knowledge, information, and specialized education are just as much parts of capital, knowledge capital, as is the most elementary labor of the worker. And just as we found on the side of human surplus value, insofar as it resulted from decoded flux, an incommensurability or a fundamental asymmetry, no assignable exterior limit, between manual labor and capital, or between two forms of money, here too, on the side of the machinic surplus value resulting from scientific and technical flux of code. We find no commensurability or exterior limit between scientific or technical labor, even when highly remunerated, and the profit of capital that inscribes itself with another sort of writing. In this respect, the knowledge flow and the labor flow find themselves in the same situation, determined by capitalist decoding or deterritorialization. But if it is true that innovations are adopted only insofar as they entail a rise in profits through a lowering of costs of production, and if there exists a sufficiently high volume of production to justify them, the corollary that derives from this proposition is that investment in innovations is never sufficient to realize or absorb the surplus value of flux that is produced on the one side as in the other. Marx has clearly demonstrated the importance of the problem. The ever-widening circle of capitalism is completed, while reproducing its imminent limits on an ever larger scale, only if the surplus value is not merely produced or extorted, but absorbed or realized. If the capitalist is not defined in terms of enjoyment, the reason is not merely that his aim is the production for production's sake that generates surplus value. It also includes the realization of this surplus value. An unrealized surplus value of flux is as if not produced and becomes embodied in unemployment and stagnation. It is easy to list the principal modes of absorption of surplus value outside the spheres of consumption and investment: advertising, civil government, militarism, and imperialism. The role of the state in this regard within the capitalist axiomatic is the more manifest, in that what it absorbs is not sliced from the surplus value of the firms, but added to their surplus value by bringing the capitalist economy closer to full output within the given limits, and by widening these limits in turn, especially within an order of military expenditures that are in no way competitive with private enterprise. Quite the contrary. It took a war to accomplish what the New Deal had failed to accomplish. The role of a politico-military economic complex is the more manifest in that it guarantees the extraction of human surplus value on the periphery and in the appropriated zones of the center, but also because it engenders, for its own part, an enormous machinic surplus value by mobilizing the resources of knowledge and information capital, and finally, because it absorbs the greater part of the surplus value produced. It's a small paragraph. It's an easy one. Don't worry about it. Oh, Jack bounced. Damn. That's okay. So let's talk about, it's a fucking huge paragraph. As we make our way through all of this book, again, we're talking about sort of alliant, the X and Y, the alliant and the filiative. The affiliative line being that which you create, the alliant lines, the extensive, that which is sort of our way of matching with others. When we talk about human surplus value, and here they say it always continues to remain decisive. They then launch into really, it's kind of a lot. Trying to figure out where I even want to start with this. Fuck. Well, we just finished talking about innovation and how it's used and how it's sort of played within the space of industrial capital, that it's not innovation for innovation's sake, as they literally go on to say. What determines the lowering of costs and the elevation of the rate of profit through machine of surplus value is not innovation. Innovation isn't the thing that does this. The innovation of value is not, like, we can't say, oh, this is an innovation of 12 or this is an innovation of 2. It's not quantifiable, no more than human surplus value. Really, it's not even about the profitability of the new technique considered in isolation, because the new technique, the new cheese grater, that doesn't matter. That itself can't be considered as such. Instead, what matters is the effect on the overall profitability of the firm, the business, the where we write in the books profit, and its relationship with the market and with commercial and financial capital. It is not that a business innovates and figures out how to do something better and therefore does. No, it's much more that change and its relationship with the profitability of the firm, and with that, the firm's relationships with market and commercial financial capital. This, as they sort of go through and they sort of run through some examples, but ultimately they say, alliance capital exerts a strong selective pressure on machinic innovations within industrial capital. In brief, and this is again, think of the blacksmith, the pizza smith, and all the examples, where flux are decoded, the specific flux of code that have taken a technical and scientific form are subjected to a properly socialized axiomatic that is much more severe than than all scientific axiomatics. We'll get to what they mean in a few seconds. Much more severe than old codes and overcodes. The axiomatic of the world capitalist market. Axiomatic is a fundamental truth, and they mean it quite in the mathematical sense. They don't mean it as like a thing we take for granted, like an axiom. No, they mean it the fundamental truth that's very much built in. And for them, it is that of the world capitalist market. The way that the scientific mind or the technical mind, engineer efforts, the guy who makes the fucking cheese grater better, Lego sets cheaper, whatever it is, figures out how to get mentholiptum into fucking Fruit Loops. It's a real thing, by the way. Don't buy them. They're terrible. I don't know why I did. My kid wanted them. They're disgusting. But instead, those scientists and that work, it's not liberating. And I think they're spot on here. The reason these things are done and what's driving them is not some sort of fascination or openness to scientific thought. It's the demand and the need of the global marketplace and the relationship the business has with that marketplace, that you need to be driving profits or you go away. In brief, the flux of code that are liberated in science and techness by this capitalist regime, there is a machinic surplus value that does not depend on the science and technists themselves, but on capital. A surplus value that is added to human surplus value and that comes to correct the relative diminution of the latter. This is, as they say, both of them. This constitutes the whole of the surplus value that characterizes the system. This combination, as we have an innovation or efficiency found through software engineering, invention, innovation, whatever we may call it, it's the scientific, the technical, the inventor kind of effort, the labor that's being done there. This plus human labor is the entirety of it. But it's not that the machine is the thing that does it. This kind of, again, a thing you find a lot of capitalists talking about, a thing you find a lot of people on the right, and you find a lot of liberals talking about, is this sort of, especially technocrats. They talk about the machine as though the machine is the thing. It's this independent element, but it's not. It really isn't. The machine exists also as labor from the engineer mind, the intellectual labor done. We tend to think of manual labor as the only labor. It's not. And so we have now this surplus value that has been created through both types of labor, the intellectual labor, which has created the technic, and then the technic, which has reduced the amount of human labor, but still human labor in both cases is the decisive factor. Knowledge, information, specialized education are just as much parts of capital as is the most elementary labor of the worker. We often think, someone in the YouTube chat, is the cotton gin a good example? Yes. I mean, yes. That's a very good example of a horrifying one, but none of them are great, but it's absolutely a good example of this. This is the labor that goes into the person who thought of that, the efforts that go into it. And again, it's generally not even one person. These things are efforts from people building. There may be one inventor, but they have machinists and engineers around them and everyone support, like that structure that exists to support them. All of that labor is labor. They're just as much parts of capital as is the most elementary labor of the worker. And just as we found on the side of human surplus value, insofar as it results for decoded flux, an incommensurability, a fundamental asymmetry between manual labor and capital, or two forms of money. Remember, we talked about the constant capital versus industrial capital. Here, too, on the side of machinic surplus value resulting from scientific and technical flux of code, there's no commensurability or exterior limit between scientific or technical labor, even when remunerated, and the profit of capital that inscribes itself with another sort of writing. The guy who makes or invents or uses his labor to build that better cheese grater, the only reason that ever gets used is because he's never compensated correctly. There's a famous Marxist economist, Wolf, and I generally don't like a lot of how he talks about stuff. He kind of oversimplifies, but he opens up one of his points of that I love, which is no one is ever paid what they're worth. If they were, businesses would fail. Because if you were paid what you were worth, the actual amount of profit that you put into the system or money made, you wouldn't be profitable to have. Necessarily, you have to be paid less than what you're worth. It's the way capitalism works. We like to think of this in terms of manual labor, but this is true at every level. The people who invented, for example, and it's not two guys, but the guys who invented the Google search engine, or the engineers who coded Google Wallet or Apple Wallet, the amount of money and profit that they have put into the system is extraordinary. They're paid pretty damn well. They are, but it's not right. The amount of money that they put out, it's not. It's always asymmetrical. It's the same as they're saying. It's the same here. It's the side of machinic surplus value resulting from scientific technical flows of code. We find no commensurability or external limit between scientific and technical labor and the profit of capital that inscribes itself in another sort of writing. In this respect, the knowledge flux and labor flux find themselves in the same situation. determined by capitalist decoding or deterritorialization. This is a big important part. This is the nature of the expenditures on these things, the nature of how they're used, where they're found, that labor is labor, human effort is human effort, the human as the decisive element here. This is, by the way, going to be a really important paragraph as we move forward and we find people talking about AI, mostly people who don't understand AI. But this is a pretty important one for that. Lily says, this is the reason for focus groups and more. Innovations are risks, writers, until a bestseller or two and a good agent. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. Focus groups don't actually happen as much as people think. I've been in the room for a few. Focus groups are primarily used by companies to kill products, not to really test and see whether they should go out. They do it as we took it to focus groups, and therefore this becomes an excuse. I can give you a bunch of reasons for that. But when we talk about like innovations inside of anything, because I think you're talking, Lily, now at the more creative side. Oh, I've got a really interesting storyline for a show, or a new way of doing a video game, or something that's really odd. The first question is going to be, will this make us more money than we put into it? And that thing, and let's take, for example, pick fucking any great small indie movie that did gangbusters numbers. My favorite is going to be probably Blair Witch Project. The people behind the Blair Witch Project and at large generated an extraordinary amount of money for what they did. And it was an innovative, odd thing, and no one really believed in them, but enough people did. They were able to get going. As they sort of made their way out, the theaters and movie companies and production and distribution houses and popcorn makers and soda makers and everyone else, a lot of people made a fuck ton of money off of Blair Witch Project. They made good money off of it, sure. Is it as much money as they made? Absolutely not. It can't be, because if it was, there would be no profit. They necessarily have to have profit, and the companies behind it then went and put more money into other projects like the Blair Witch 2, which was horrifying. And they basically had money to invest elsewhere, because it's the same thing. The manual laborer who lays brick and gets paid less, just because we're talking about scale here, is really the only difference. Gets paid $4 an hour, but is doing $10 an hour worth of work and making $6 profit per hour for his employer. There is that horrifying asymmetry that is the same asymmetry as the people who figure out how to make, who made Blair Witch, or who made a new type of lithium ion battery, or the way that the Tesla works. Did none of those. Most people don't do any of those things. Instead, they make a new type of gear shaft, or this or that, and they made good money. And so we don't tend to think of intellectual labor in the same way, but we should, especially as intellectual labor gets pushed further and further down upon and becomes itself basically awful. Yeah, Lily, Blair Witch comes to mind. A friend of mine, Simon, he's the guy who his team did a VHS 1 and 2. He did The Guest, was one of his movies he directed. These people don't make really good money. They make better money than a bricklayer by a wide margin. But I actually am more surprised every day by how much the capitalist who literally puts money into these things, and I've met Chip. I met the guys who funded Avatar through Fox. Fox didn't fund Avatar. There's external funders who fund these things, and they're kind of nice. They're nice guys, really fascinating, but they're capitalists. Their thing is, I put money in, I get money out, and that's the way that they have their power and their control. That's the way these things get done. Movie studios don't have as much money as people think. They have money. They sort of run it. Things don't work how you think they do. Everything's fucked. Sorry, that's a really depressing way to put it, but I don't have another way to put it, really. But hey, what can I say? To continue though, but if it is true that innovations are adopted only insofar as they entail a rise in profits through a lowering of the cost of production, which, Blair Witch is a great example of that, if there exists a sufficiently high volume of production to justify them, the corollary that derives from this proposition is that investment in innovations is never sufficient to realize or absorb the surplus value of flux that is produced on one side as in the other. This is, again, stating just the same thing that we were talking about earlier with manual labor. Marx demonstrated the importance of the problem. The ever-widening circle of capitalism is completed while reproducing its imminent limits on an ever larger scale, only if surplus value is not merely produced or extorted, but absorbed or realized. It has to become an actual thing. It has to become realized. It isn't just that there's excess value being created in some grand visual or grand thing or Palace of Versailles and this sort of, amazing. It has to become realized. It has to become concretized. If the capitalist is not defined in terms of enjoyment, it's not merely that his aim is the production for production's sake that generates surplus value. This also includes the realization of this surplus value. An unrealized surplus value of flux is as if not produced and becomes embodied in unemployment and stagnation. This is the way capitalism functions. This is not new. Go read Capital. I really don't feel like reading Capital to all of you now. It's easy to list the principal modes of absorption of surplus value outside the spheres of consumption and investment. This phrasing, before we get into the examples, the phrasing here is important. And I want to make sure, one sec, just give me 2 seconds to, I want to make sure I have the right version for this one. Because it's, I just want to make sure I'm getting it right in the French. Apologies. All right, page 279. Yeah. Very. When we talk about absorption, the absorption of the surplus value, the concretizing, the realizing of it, because the surplus value is nonetheless created. There is nonetheless profit there. There's a lot of shit happening that's really important to understand and sort of grasp. This setup, when we talk about how it's realized, it comes in a lot of different ways. And the examples they give, the advertising, civil service, militarism, imperialism, this is the nature of what the state does, or also apparatuses sort of around it. Advertising is one of those fascinating things they'll kind of get into a little bit. But the state within the capitalist axiomatic, as they say, is more manifest in that what it absorbs is not sliced from surplus value, but added to their surplus by bringing the capitalist economy closer to full output within given limits. There is X amount of shit that has to be expended. There is no way to get around it. We have to have a way to expel from society or to generate or to do something with this surplus value, or it will burst. It's a fucked up system. How do we do that? Well, we spend it. We spend it on extraordinary wars. This is not a judgment, by the way, on whether wars are worthwhile. We will get into that. They're definitely not. But if we talk about how we're expending money, say for Ukraine, it's a really fucking interesting thing. Basically, the US government isn't sending money to Ukraine. That's wrong. Instead, what we're doing is we're sending them vouchers that they get to spend with US companies. So we're paying ourselves to bake things that are fully destroyed, that are consumed. A bomb is consumed. It doesn't hang around. We don't go, oh, look, it's a 90-year-old bomb. I guess it's going to be more valuable now. Like, this shit gets blown up. It gets consumed. The nature of it is gone, but it is realized on balance sheets inside of another part of the business that allows us to take the excess value and put it into that. This happens across the board. The civil government is a great example of this. Imperialism is another that I don't think takes a lot of thinking to sort of realize how money is expended, and then it still is able to also come back and fund within the system itself. It's a fascinating sort of back and forth. This, as they say, the role of a politico-military economic complex is the more manifest in that it guarantees the extraction of human surplus value on the periphery and in the appropriated zones at the center, but also because it engenders for its own part an enormous machinic surplus value by mobilizing the resources of knowledge and information capital, and finally because it absorbs the greater part of the surplus value produced. This is the nature of the state within capital and why we have the state. It absorbs the vast majority of the surplus that's produced, produces with it, and even may revisit it as on the balance books internally. Without that, we would just have an extraordinary amount of excess that would really have no place, at least within our system. A lot, isn't it? Very good chapter, though. No? Maybe? A little bit? Anyone? Got something for me?
There we go. Would you say then that the biggest and most important part of a capital project is working out what will generate profit, and that theme, I guess, runs through the whole thing, like the design, and if you're doing a movie, like the makeup and making sure that your characters have the right sort of fashion tone and everything, your pizza shop has the right decor and all that. It runs through everything.
It does. So examples I love to give are what I would say projects that are, they're not without a profit margin, like people still consider them, but there's a slightly different mentality when people aren't trying to minimize the bottom line kind of constantly. A friend of mine made a movie. It got an $8.9 million budget from this sort of semi-crowdfunding thing. It's a real fascinating process. He made this extraordinary movie called Mandy. And the way that movies like Mandy are made is they're aware of their budgets. They're aware what they can spend, but it's a different mental space for how they produce, what they produce, and all of that. But also, by the way, this is still part of this last bit of intellectual work. We'll get to that. But it still bleeds into it. You have to be able to drive X, Y, and Z dollar for makeup, for costumes, for fucking filming, are you filming on film or digital? Is it cheaper? Like all of these things, because what matters is that you're able to, one, get to the finish line, because it's its own battle with a film, because costs never go down. They only ever go up. Or with any sort of production, you tend to find that. But as you sort of make your way through, the reality is you've got to be thinking about, will this hurt product X? There's a lot of simple examples, because again, one of the things we shouldn't be doing here is thinking about them as though the company did a thing or a person made sure that a thing happened. None of these processes sort of exist as a single person's choice. Instead, be thinking about the way that intellectual work or even manual labor, where they come together on these projects, how they come together, and where we find this sort of middle ground where there is still money as the center of the piece, but people believe they're making art. It's one of my favorite places to sort of be. And you run into this sort of across the board. But again, there's exceptions to this. And it's kind of its own fascinating thing, because the way financial capital works is the promise of potential changes in innovation in how we will be able to find money. Because take virtual reality. Virtual reality is a fucking amazing example of this. There really was never a use case for virtual reality. It was innovation, almost very much for innovation's sake, for a very long time. It's not a new tech. It's a tech that's been around since the 80s and 90s. Some guy in his basement made a semi-cheapish version of it that he called the Oculus, kickstarted it, and it got this huge buzz. The idea behind it and how it went forward was driving. Oh my God, it sold a bunch. He made a ton of money on that sort of first thing because it was cheaper to manufacture them than to sell them. He made actually pretty good money. That rise behind what Parker did and that entire push didn't have backing because it was a hype cycle. So when Oculus was bought by Microsoft for billions of dollars, what ended up sort of happening, and it's again fascinating, they've not turned a profit. Oculus has never made money. A lot of these groups don't make money, but they make money elsewhere because they are basically vehicles for debt and vehicles for financialization elsewhere that can then be invested in and side invested in and purchased secondarily, similar to credit default swaps in the 2008 stock market crash. So these things have more complex realities to them, but ultimately it still comes back to the sort of drive of where the intellectual labor, the human labor, where these things collide and where the X over DX or the XDX setup presupposes it will be or where it will be realized, and the potential upsides or downsides of that a capitalist can then invest in order to have money make money. And that's their goal, is to put money in, not to make a product. They don't give a fuck about a product. They don't care. Instead, they are very, very cynical, almost to a person. Will this make me money? Will my $100,000 I put in come out with a friendly $30,000 on top of it? That return they expect and they want. Ideally, they get 5, 10, 20, 30x on their investment. And you see the money tossed in that way because, again, XDX, these are all the things that matter to them. It's capital, profit, profit, profit. So it bleeds down the entire way, if that makes sense. Lily, I'm sorry for the ramble. It's a fascinating setup. I don't think I answered your question, though. I hope I answered your question. Someone on YouTube asked, is this Bataille? Yes.
It doesn't matter. It was fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. Bataille and his general economy is very much what we're talking about here. If you haven't read The Accursed Share, highly recommend it. Short version. There is no such thing as a closed system. All systems sort of have excess. There's an excess produced by any system because no system is closed. The Earth overall is producing more than it kind of is receiving. The sun is putting heat into it, but there's a lot more than just heat happening here. There's other things, like there's no closed system. As such, everything is sort of constantly has an excess that it needs to expel. It needs to get rid of. It needs to sort of excise in some capacity. And that's this ending part they're talking about here is we have this absorption of surplus value of militarism, imperialism, civil government. Advertising is a fascinating one as well, because it's another type of consumption ultimately, because it's about managing taste and sort of managing cultural things. It doesn't really have it is its own thing. It, as much as a bomb gets dropped somewhere has very specific results. A billboard going up has particular results. It is the thing. It is the end of the line of consumption. It isn't just another part. It's taste management, as they'll come to call it. But there isn't like a single global balance to any of this. We never reach that, and it's not possible to reach that. It's not going to happen. That's kind of it. The role of this complex is the more manifest in that it guarantees the extraction of human surplus value on the periphery and in the appropriated zones. This political military thing, this what we're doing in Ukraine, what's happening with Israel, what's happening with, everywhere we are and whatever we're doing. I'm American, so the answer is everywhere we're doing shit. And it's able to absorb and take in that surplus value that's produced, and there's a lot of it.
Can you explain what how anti-production relates to this surplus value?
Yes. So anti-production is, how do I want to put this? Okay. Anti-production is not the opposite of production. It sort of is. That's why they're using it, but it's not production that's working against production. It's how to put it. Let me think through. So when we have a connection in the syntheses, we have the production of desire. There's also anti-production within this process. And anti-production is not lack. Anti-production is instead a positively produced element through the sort of syntheses and productive syntheses that ultimately comes back on and sort of desexualizes or de-radicalizes desire, that kind of gets rid of the spark and makes it in terms of metaphor, think of it as desire as this flux of pure energy that's sort of rocking and wild. And anti-production is the version of that that's just the inert, inert carbon rod that doesn't really do anything except to like sit there, to be a thing that blocks, that holds back, that sets it on. This is where anti-production sort of comes into things within the Earth Socius, for example. Anti-production, when we talk about it, anti-production is kind of the death instinct. So the first Socius, when you have the carvings taken into your body, when you have these very, very particular social interactions that are brutal and holding back and deeply repressive, you are going to be this warrior. You are in this place. You have these connections. You have these social standings. Anti-production is the produced element that is doing that. It is think of as the inert blocking mass that doesn't really connect. It doesn't do anything. It just sort of, again, desexualizes or neutralizes the connections as they're made. The anti-production is going to be complex and get going in a lot of this. God, I probably should spend a lot more time on it. They're going to be getting a lot more into it from here out, but this is where anti-production sort of comes in. Shicey says, anti-production is system-sustaining expense. That's actually not a terrible way to look at it. I think it's a more complicated answer because you're talking about like what the effect it ends up having. But that's pretty much spot on. Anti-production, give me 2 seconds. Let me find a really good. What D&G have laid out for us so far with the 3 syntheses, connection, disconnection, recording, and then consummation, consumption, is an affirming view of how desire and the passions within us make their way outward. But of course, they didn't just say we live in a vacuum. These 3 syntheses are not in a vacuum. Instead, they make their way out and they become consumed. And by the way, they do within your semi-individuality, within the connected syntheses that ultimately create you and create your subjectivity and all of us. So at some point, they then produce sort of outwardly. They become social, and we exist socially. When we interact socially, it's not going to be through the 3 syntheses. Socially, we're not determined that way. Socially, we're determined differently. We're determined through the socius. The social production is that. It falls back on the socius. The socius, as these sort of things, begin coming out, and think of, again, the millions of connections, disconnections, and consumptions that are happening in your subjectivity, mine, all of us, every single person out there, and then those colliding and interacting socially, then we run into what you might call feedback. Actually, would probably be not a terrible way to talk about it. The social world and how we sort of deal with things superimposes on us through a lot of different mechanisms. We talk through the Earth. It's the scarification, the tattooing, the pain rituals, the theater of cruelty, the demands and needs of the immediacy, the anti-production that's produced through the social world, then impinging back on us. Because again, we are historically determined. We don't just grow naturally. We grow also within the social. As this happens, the anti-production is produced within us that creates the repression, that blocks us, that blocks desire from emergently going as it would without anything else. This doesn't have to be necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's repressive. Repression is a thing. Within each of the social modes, this happens. Our desire for the desire of the other that happens within the despotism of things, within the despotic, within that sort of mode of existence. It's the same thing. It impinges back on production and desiring production with anti-production. And anti-production sustains the system. It's a really great way of putting it, Shicey. It exists as the sort of self-encountered repression of these things. So when we have anti-production entering into the productive syntheses, it's introducing needs and lack into desiring production. It's building into it these social ideas of things that are, again, fairly inert. Anti-production isn't reactive. Think of it that way. It's not reactive. It's just bloop there. And it desexualizes because it's all sexual. It's all connective. It's all energetic. It removes that. It's much more in line with Freud's death instinct than anything else. And so with this, the relations of, I'm just going to quote Holland now, these relations of anti-production that organize the social expenditure of surplus in ways that either inhibit or foster the institution of power relations of various kinds. To the familiar Marxist dualisms, this adds extra terms. The dialectic of forces, relations of productions, become the interplay of forces and the relation of production and forces of relations of anti-production. It's these two coming together that allows or doesn't allow, depending, obviously, the expenditure to happen, or the expression of these final bits. And this is a big deal to them because from the beginning for them, I'm going to read a little bit of Holland here. This will be taking us back a little bit into chapters 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. Anti-production as the organization of matter and energy flux on the socius provides a crucial corrective to what Deleuze and Guattari called the exchangism of Levi-Strauss. The concept of the socius provides a materialist basis for what Strauss called the symbolic order. That is, for the codes and the systems of inscription that organize desire socially in the different modes of social production. As Levi-Strauss has shown, kinship terminology and myths organize desire according to the codes of a symbolic order, as do legal codes promulgated by despots to govern subordinate peoples of empires, and the laws governing the sale of labor and other commodities, for example, in a very different form of symbolic order. Social coding on the socius for D&G organizes bodies, practices, and objects, as well as symbols and words, as it does for Strauss. But the founder of structuralism, social organization ultimately everywhere is the same, always amounts to exchange, whether women, words, stories, prestige objects, or goods. For Deleuze and Guattari, by contrast, as chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus shows, social organization is not everywhere the same. Forms of coding and systems of inscription differ significantly among the three ideal mode types of social production, in part because desire is organized or inscribed on the type of socius specific to each mode of social production, the earth, despot, or capital. More importantly, symbolic order everywhere is ultimately based not on exchange, but debt, which itself takes diverse forms in the modes of social production, as we will see. This is the force of debt. This is anti-production. This is, as you recall, anti-production is, in the social as well as psychological realm, a transformation of productive energy or force whereby a full body falls back on the economy it appropriates. It is the conversion of a portion of superabundant forces of production into a counterforce that absorbs, distributes, and consumes already produced products in the name of a creditor to whom debt is owed. Of course, the debt collectively owed to the earth and savagery is unlike the debt subordinate people owe to the despot, which is quite unlike the debt owed to capital under capitalism. Indeed, more important than the figure to whom the debt is nominally owed is the system of anti-production the debt sustains, for the social management of excess as debt is its primary raison d'etre. You never pay capital itself. You pay a bank. You never pay a god or king, but a priest. Never the earth, but a shaman or your ancestor. Debt is thus the general name under which relations of social obligation are enforced by anti-production. It is the principal means by which lack is deposited, distributed, vacualized into the real. Now, this setup as we're moving forward, and we're about to take like a full step into anti-production, but this is where we start seeing anti-production show its head. Does that make sense as an answer to the question? It was you, JK, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks. It's pretty, pretty complex, and yeah, that's what I was.
It is not an easy one. I'm going to say it's not an easy one because a lot of people think of it as, oh, it's antimatter. It's like anti-production, so it cancels out production, or it's the opposite of production. And it's like it's trying to make a move. Again, we're trying to talk about a materialist conception of all of this. So that's kind of the big deal. So the question is, what's the material? Well, the material is desire and partial objects. This is the material of things. So what happens then? Well, things connect, disconnect, get consumed. Great, this is what desire happens. But at larger social formations seem to become real, and they fall back on desire. And so desire, when that happens, desire notices and sees these odd blockages where it's desire that's no longer like, how to put it, no longer connective, no longer excited. It's think of it as like an inert block of nothing. It hits, desire sees that, but it goes, oh, that's supposed to be there. And it has to go around it or get caught by it or be trapped by it in some way. But now that structure that anti-production is part of has fallen back, and desire has to make its way around it or be trapped by it.
But it's not directly what Freud posits as a death instinct, right? It's
pretty close.
Because Freud's notion of death instinct is somehow transcendent. It's outside the system, outside of eros. So, but what you're saying is that anti-production is within the in the process of desire and production, right?
So it's a little more complex than that, in that in a, let's say, an idealized form of desire production would be connection, disconnection, recording, consumption. This is the three syntheses. Three syntheses aren't perfect. There's paralogisms that fall into them and deal with it. So when we're talking about things that affect desire, it's not that it's transcendent to say you have this anti-production that falls into it because it's part of a larger social structure. For example, you're a family and your father beats the shit out of you if you don't, brush your teeth every night. So regardless of kind of where you end up with this fucking bunch of anti-production that's deeply repressive and fucks you up in a lot of ways. But there you are at bedtime and you're like, oh fuck, I need to, what's that? Like you have anxiety. Desire isn't just freely connecting anymore. Now you have these larger social things that have fallen in place and that your desire can't connect to, can't deal with. So you could say it's transcendental. You could say it is a thing that exists beyond you, but it is still material because desire produces everything. Everything is material. The larger social world produces anti-production that gets put into our desire and production chain. It's the paralogisms come to roost. And this thing, to me, it's their reconception of it. Guattari goes much deeper into it in Chaosmosis, as well as, the other book, Psychoanalysis and Transversality, I think. But he goes much deeper into how he takes the death instinct and moves it, but it's very much in line with that. And again, think of it as, and the reason I think they end up equating it most with the death instinct is the idea of it. The death instinct is about returning to a place where there is no, like, we go back to place. It's self-destructive, sure, but it's no longer that we're organic. It's a desire to become inert. It's a desire towards heat death. And And that's very much what this is. It is a response of anti-production to that. Anti-production makes that, I guess I would say. Does that make sense, JK?
Oh yeah, yeah,
All right.
that does. Thanks.
All right, good. Any other questions? Yeah. So still, it is the death instinct. When I said, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly, death instinct, but it comes from the way that at its base, the social world is informed by debts. So not deaths, debts. Debt being that we owe X, Y, and Z to the earth, we owe X, Y, and Z to the despot, we owe X, Y, and Z to capital. The debt that we have to the social world, etc. The death instinct, and Freud came about. It's his time in seeing World War II happen, and kind of trying to figure out why people would like this. I actually kind of enjoy the idea of the death instinct. It's one of the things from Freud that I think works nicely in this sort of materialist conception. But at its base, the idea is it manifests as this sort of blockage of productive sexual desire. It just blocks. It is inert. It doesn't react. It's not, it reacts and does other things. It's death. Now, these blocks of anti-production come from the way that we socially have debt and how debt is organized. So they cross over. They do sound super familiar. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it the same. I should do better with that. Do much better with that. All right. I feel like getting to the next paragraph is going to be good. So let's do the next paragraph. We'll probably have discussion open up there, and we'll do Andre Gort's profile next week. So we'll have discussion open up at the end here, if that sounds good to everyone here. The state, its police, and its army form a gigantic enterprise of anti-production. But at the heart of production itself and conditioning this production, here we discover a new determination of the properly capitalist field of immanence. Not only the interplay of the relations and differential coefficients of decoded flux, not only the nature of the limits that capitalism reproduces on an ever wider scale as interior limits, but the presence of anti-production within production itself. The apparatus of anti-production is no longer a transcendent instance that opposes production, limits it, or checks it. On the contrary, it insinuates itself everywhere in the productive machine and becomes firmly wedded to it in order to regulate its productivity and realize surplus value, which explains, for example, the difference between the despotic bureaucracy and the capitalist bureaucracy. The effusion from the apparatus of anti-production is characteristic of the entire capitalist system. The capitalist effusion is that of anti-production within production at all levels of the process. On the one hand, it alone is capable of realizing capitalism's supreme goal, which is to produce lack in large aggregates, to introduce lack where there is always too much by affecting the absorption of overabundant resources. On the other hand, it alone doubles the capital and the flux of knowledge with a capital and an equivalent flux of stupidity that also affects an absorption and a realization, and that ensures the integration of groups and individuals into a system. Not only lack amid overabundance, but stupidity in the midst of knowledge and science. It will be seen in particular how it is at the level of state and military that the most progressive sectors of scientific or technical knowledge combine with those feeble archaisms bearing the greatest burden of current functions. The use of stupid here, I want to make sure is in the original. Sorry, give me 2 seconds. Apologies. It's such a really great piece. I want to make sure I'm getting the exact right words. Boop, boop, boop. There you are. Thank you, PDF. I do love it. Yeah. Um, where do we start? The Earth Socius, as Holland was talking about, and I was kind of hinting at, the Earth Socius and the despotic, anti-production is part of sort of the social space. It's not really within production itself. You find instead the socius bears down almost directly. So we have desire that's supplanted and taken by the connective syntheses and then appropriated. This setup is, survival reasons, blah, 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 all of that. But there really isn't those other steps to the processes. There isn't really a consumption within me as a consumer. I don't, in the Earth Socius, consume my desire. It's the opposite, actually. The social world is consuming my desire. I exist socially, but I connect with everyone else. The way anti-production is made there is through the social interactions. Anti-production is produced, again, within the despotic, very much the same way, but again, a little bit further down the process. I still don't have subjectivity being produced, not in the way that we talk about it or they're speaking about it here, or we would talk about it under the capitalists. The existence is different. The repression happens very quickly, generally right after the second syntheses. These coincide, without, for good reason. We now have the sort of disconnective recording by the biunivocalization of things. That selection happens because anti-production exists socially, but is now within that space. Now it works differently because now I do consume my own, I consume everything myself, my own intensities across the board. All of us do. Subjectivity is produced that way now. So where would anti-production exist? Because now it's after I consume, but I've already consumed. That's because anti-production has moved imminently into the process. In fact, it's within almost every step of it. It's no longer this thing that opposes production. The Earth Socius would have rules against, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? Why don't we make the world better? Why don't we make things more efficient? Why don't I do X? They don't even get to that point because there is no I, because you exist in this space. In the despotic, the same thing. It's the limits of production are very particularized. They're controlled by the despot. It puts everything into, again, either or, and this determinist, what are we going to be doing? It's what he says. Now we don't have that anymore. There's no opposition to my production on the other side of things. Instead, it moves interior. It becomes part of itself. It insinuates itself everywhere in the productive machine and becomes wedded to it to regulate productivity and realize surplus value, which explains the difference between the despotic bureaucracy and the capitalist bureaucracy. The capitalist bureaucracy being the one that's Kafkaesque, as we sort of have laws that are sort of made, but also lots of paperwork and forms and all of these various things. The bureaucracy of the despot is that of his priests, as the example that they give, the priests going village to village, giving edicts. The sheriff who runs the town, it's much more direct, much more specific in terms of like how it's sort of visited. This difference is actually a great example of it, because now we have, instead of having to have repression on the person, we don't have to have that as much. We put the repression within the person. The system does. The system builds anti-production and builds anti-production into the very productive process of desire itself within us. And we consume the intensities at the end of that. So when we talk about how we are produced within capitalism, if I just need to free myself from it. No. Socially, you exist once and the same with the social system. There is no you separate from it. There is no desiring production separate from it. The social system is desiring production. You are within that. So when you've consumed your intensities, the social order has already done it, because the process didn't start after the social world. You were born into a social world. And so everything you're experiencing that goes into those three syntheses has already had its social determinations. It's already got anti-production built into it. And now you've integrated it. So by the time you've gotten to figuring out who you are, you've already been repressed. You're already there. And this is kind of the amazing part of the entire thing, because we necessarily need to separate out and have lack produced in very specific ways for the capitalist system to function. As they say, just real quick, this effusion from the apparatus of active characteristic of the system. On the one hand, it alone is capable of realizing capitalism's supreme goal, which is to produce lack in large aggregates, to introduce lack where there is always too much by affecting the absorption of overabundant resources. The sentence, to me, I mean, makes itself pretty nicely, but the easy version of this would be, we have people starving to death in America. I think we, as a very simple version of it, people here have a lot of money. I know people who have a lot of money, and I'm doing pretty well. And I feel nothing but stress and anxiety over cash kind of all the time. I'm not alone in this. There's a lack always where there's too much. Think of the people who exist and the people you know who have enough or even too much, and they feel like they need more. They feel like they want more. They do want more. There is a lack where there is too much. By affecting the absorption of overabundant resources, changing how these resources are absorbed or codified or brought into the system. This is where anti-production works. It alone doubles the capital and the flux of knowledge with a capital and an equivalent flow of stupidity. And they do mean stupidity here very, very specifically. This is not they don't mean this like lightly. How to phrase it?
So you're saying that the anti-production is coincides with the castration complex, in the name of the Father.
No. Say that again.
That the anti-production and this kind of idea of lack is really the Oedipal complex, right?
This is where, this is the effect of it and where we start seeing it. This isn't the actual Oedipal complex, but this is, so the phrasing they use here in French is very particular, is honoré, which is similar to stupidity. I don't think it's the same as stupidity. It means bullshit. It kind of means like dumb shit. I don't know how else to put it. That's kind of what it means, because when they're talking and they're phrasing here, the phrasing is very specifically, it alone doubles the capital and the flow of knowledge with the capital and equivalent flux of bullshit. Because what's built into this, the rest of it is bullshit. They don't really say stupidity. They mean garbage, bullshit, stuff that is, how to put it? They just mean bullshit. They really, I think they do. Yeah, because this equivalent flux of bullshit, this other side of it, the narrative of things, the representationalist take of things that is impinging, the creation of anti-production within us socially, all of this is what happens here. This is what anti-production does. It creates this sort of secondary understanding and flux of bullshit, which also affect its absorption and realization, which ensure the integration of groups and individuals into the system. This is the big deal, that there is lack within this excess. And at the level of state and the level of army, the most progressive sectors of scientific knowledge or technical, the bullshit archaisms become loaded with current functions. And this is kind of what they're kind of getting at. The way that this other layer of shit is sort of put into the existence we have, it's not just lack amid overabundance, but bullshit in the midst of knowledge and science. This is the phrasing they use, which I think is a hell of a thing.
Right. So what they mean by stupidity is this kind of, in the midst of knowledge and scientific development, innovation, it requires that you ignore a lot of truths about the world, right?
Yeah,
Because
it's
yeah,
it's not stupidity. Stupidity, I think, is stupidity to me. When I say stupidity, it means someone's lack of understanding. Um, they're not talking about that. They mean connerie. They mean bullshit. So how to put it? Oh, AI is actually a really good example of it. Bullshit in the midst of knowledge and science. Generative AI is a really interesting, fascinating technology that does some really cool shit. Like, just letting you know, it really does. It doesn't do anything like what people are saying it's going to do or how it's going to work at all. It is bullshit. These things mix. This is how this works. And this works at every single level. AI is just a really good example of it. Self-driving cars, great example. Uber driving apps, great example. iPhones, great example. Video games, great example. Computers, great example. All these things. It's not just this base level of, oh, here's what this thing does. Cool. We pretend that. But instead, actually what's happening is they're piled into with bullshit. So that way we ensure that there is a lack in the overabundance that is being provided. There's always something missing because it doesn't do 99% of the things. Anyone here who thinks AI does anything besides like guessing or sort of like programmatically placing pixels in front of each other, if it has any understanding, I've seen people talk about how it feels or how it's like, it's just stupid. It's bullshit. None of this is accurate at all. And at the level of state and military, we see bullshit at extraordinary levels. We do. We really do. With scientific and technical knowledge combined with these feeble archaisms bearing the greatest burden of the current functions. This is the last sort of step of it. And they'll be talking about this, I think, for the next 3 or 4 pages, really. Yeah, please.
Sorry. Well, at first I didn't get what words you were saying, but I think it's connerie.
Connerie, yes, sorry. I don't have a good accent.
No issue.
So is that, what does that mean?
Well, yeah, I think it can be translated by stupidity. Like when we talk about the fool in French, someone's con, like written like con, but pronounced con.
Yes.
And like it's also a very
foolish would work. Foolish, I think, is probably a better translation. So for me, the issue is with the word stupidity. I don't think stupidity means maybe exactly the same as maybe it did even when they were translating this. But when I say someone is stupid, I mean that they're dumb, that they're not intelligent. It's not the same thing to me, because I think you're right, and that connerie is along the lines of a clown, I guess. Like a clown does stupid shit. They screw stuff up, they fuck around, they do foolish things, but it's not stupid. This is exactly it. It's ignorant is the opposite of this, because ignorant is a vacuole. Ignorant would mean not knowing, and that's really not what they're getting at here. I don't think. At least I don't think so. Again, connerie doesn't mean not knowing. It means outright foolish, or it means doing really stupid shit.
Okay. So the translation for what they
real quick, JK, Estelle, is that closer? Because I love having these discussions because I find this shit fascinating.
Yeah. So instead of
no, one sec, JK, one sec. I'm asking Estelle.
Yeah, I mean, well, when we're talking about clowns, I don't think we would use the word clown for a clown. Like that's the role of a clown to do stupid stuff. We use term connerie, con, like in, well, I say we, but I can only speak from my own perspective. Like, can you say la connerie humaine, like the human stupidity, foolishness? Um, uh, I it's a versatile word.
It is. I'm hesitant to say stupid though. I mean, stupid could be used, but again, that's a contextual thing.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm posting the actual sentence in chat so you can tell me what you think. But it feels like they're saying more.
Yeah. When we talk about in that context, I that's definitely bullshit is a very nice way to translate it with.
Okay, good, because I only know a handful of swears, like, but it's a fascinating sort of. It's a fascinating one. Yeah.
Yeah. Like now it's like disconnected very like I think there's like a structural element to it like that like if we say someone is doing fake quelques conneries, is doing some stupid stuff like that's that could be translated by stupid, but like when we say about something like that's more endemic, that's more shared by many people, then like it's more appropriate to say bullshit.
Yeah, because
in my opinion.
I think it's when we say stupidity, it also implies doing like that they're doing the wrong thing, or that a smart person could go, like smartness could be in there, or intelligence might be waiting. And I think their point is that what is produced itself is stupidity. Like it's this useless bullshit garbage that exists, that is made in there, is at least how I'm reading it. So when we're talking and he says, not only lack amid overabundance, but stupidity in the midst of knowledge and science. He doesn't mean stupidity in the sense of, oh, we have some people who are dumb and we have some people who are smart. It's not that. It's he's talking about stupidity in the midst of knowledge and science, that we have the people who on the internet are writing about angels as a great example to me, where it's like the literal scientific principles that allow you to type that allow me to eat that, to read that, that sort of precludes a lot of very specific beliefs and other things. So we have this layer of bullshit along with knowledge and science, that all these things start getting sort of clamored together. Race realism would be, in my mind, an example of this, where, you know, scientific racism, it's science, but it's not fucking science. It's not science. That's not how science works. So there's bullshit mixed in with it, because we have, within the way that we discuss the technical, within the way that we discuss any of these things, it's necessary for us to have within this anti-production, within ourselves, within the systems that are sort of built, this effusion that happens that ultimately creates this lack where there's too much. And it's a lack within knowledge. It's not that you're missing knowledge. It's instead anti-production. It's the opposite of knowledge. It's bullshit. It's inert, non-interactive, non-changeable shit. Not stupidity, because stupidity can be overcome, a person can learn. But stupidity in the sense of, here's some really dumb shit with some really smart shit. Now here's a ball of it all together. You tell me which is which, kind of thing. Yeah, stupid bullshit. I think Taylor's the one I also heard this from too. Because I think he was in our first reading. So it's a really particular phrasing they're using here, because again, I've seen, and I'm more reacting kind of in advance to other readings, where people talk about, oh, it produces an unintelligent group of people. That's why we have bad schools, because they want us to. It's like, no, you're taking it really far. It's particular in what they're saying, that within our production, within the production that's in you, me, all of us, all of that, this anti-production is being formed. And what it does is with capital, which needs to create lack where there's overabundance, think of knowledge the same way as they've been showing, that the knowledge of the technical, the engineering mind, the technical mind, the inventor mind that we have, it's also got to be filled with lack. But lack isn't just sort of an empty vacuole space. That's the opposite of what it is. It's anti-production. So think of knowledge with an inert, useless garbage matter that it can't do anything with, mashed together. And so that's why they use the term connerie, stupid bullshit. And I'm not pronouncing it correctly still, and I apologize eternally. But it's not even, no, Jordan, it's not Dunning-Kruger effect. This is Laboratory Life by Bruno Latour, the now departed wonderful, wonderful writer, where Bruno Latour spent time with scientists. He like an ethnological study by hanging out in the lab, and basically talked through how science is socially determined, because it's not just, we have this fantasy that science exists in this perfectly objective realm, that every scientist is the best scientist is wholly objective, instead of understanding that the reality is they're all people. They all exist socially. They all were determined socially. And so alongside the science, which sure, they have maybe perfect knowledge, they have a lot of other bullshit. And the bullshit isn't really interactive desiring machines or desire or fuck energy that's able to be connected with. It's anti-production. It's naturally repressive, and it's bullshit. And it's not Dunning-Kruger. It's other knowledge. It's bullshit knowledge, but it's other knowledge. That's the thing they're wanting to get us at, is when we talk about the repression of production, we are able to think of it in terms of labor. If I stop you from working, or if I convince you, like let's say you're working at my factory, great, you're hammering a thing, you smack it with a hammer, that's your job. And over time, why do you do that job? Well, it's your place in the factory. You've decided the reason you do this is because you're the hammer guy. And I've convinced you of that because there's this large story and what you see around you. You're hammer guy. That's what you do. There's no difference in the world of intellectual or scientific or engineering. That's still labor and still works the same. And knowledge within all of us, especially capital, has the same kind of repression happening, has the same kind of secondary thing. We still have this. And so it's important to understand the production of our subjectivity that is allowing us to be in these spaces, that is giving us, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I'm building this, I'm doing that. We've got knowledge, we've got science, all that great stuff, but we also have this other huge mass of bullshit, just total crap. That is maybe just a perfect Foucault line. 90% of shit I believe is based on spurious information. There we go. 90% of shit I believe is based on spurious information, passed down to me inadvertently by the actions of the poor misinformed idiots who came before me. When you're a parent, you understand this much more. Trust me. Majorly much more. But this is it. We have, I have relatives who are, top of the field physics, like brilliant. The shit they believe is insane, interpersonally, but also like, they're just nuts. But they're smart. They have knowledge, but they also have a ton of bullshit. By the way, I do too. So do all of you. Like, it's the nature of this sort of double edge. Again, we're talking about labor. We're always talking about labor.
So would this kind of specious knowledge be based on a kind of a lack or anti-production that maybe imbues us with a desire for things that are not really what we need, but artificial kinds of desire?
Artificial kind of separates us from them. So I'm hesitant to say immediately yes, that instead think of it as the complexities of the entire process that's happening, that we are consuming, and we are consumers of that. what we are consuming is the mass of all of these things, including the bullshit, in order to produce, like, as part of that, as part of anti-production. We're consuming all of this as we're going through, constantly consuming this. And so it's less that these desires become artificial, but more that they become, there's a reason they use the term paralogism, improper, out of order. They become broken. They become repressive.
Because if the whole system is based on this, idea of profitability and efficiency towards ultimately profitability, then there's a lot of, our science and knowledge is also, captivated by that. And so we are, imbued with all these, program with all these, kinds of knowledge based on that, that kind of, you know, system that has been geared towards, this idea of profitability.
I feel like I want to do the next paragraph because I think the story of gourds actually would help, but maybe that we're going to end up going way fucking over time. I feel like I don't want to go too much further, though. All right, we'll take a vote.
I think it'd be good to read it, and then it's a short paragraph.
It is a shorter paragraph, I think, yes. But it is a lot. We'd end up being here for another 45 minutes. I'm actually going to say we're going to end here, because we'll leave it on a cliffhanger. Because I think later this week when I do my Anti-Oedipus open house, we'll have a chat about this. We'll kind of spend some time talking about anti-production in this. Probably that'll be fucking Friday. So keep an eye out. It might be Thursday evening, but probably be Friday during the day, maybe a little bit later. And we'll spend time on this. And then next week we'll come back to Gortz. I want to be able to go back and reread that his work before, because it's basically super, super, super important to this. I cut off. Did I get cut off?
No, you're still here.
Oh. Then here's what we're gonna do. So later this week, I'm gonna do a review of the last two paragraphs. Christ, maybe three. We'll do a reading group and general connection. Think about it. Spend some time. Put together some thoughts or questions, because it's a lot. Next week, I will pre-read and set up for Andrea Gort's work, and we'll go through that. There's a lot in it that I think is worth going over, and we'll spend a little bit of time chatting through it. That'll be the setup. So for now, we'll end for today. Yeah, end for today, and keep an eye out for the reading later this week, the revisiting later this week, and then next week we'll continue. That'll be good, because I think I don't want to go into the next bit. I'm a little fried after the last 2 hours. It's kind of a lot. Otherwise, thank you all for joining. I look forward to it as always. Go find something bullshit to do, and go service capital. Thank you all.